January 14th, 1945. The Baltic coast. Corporal Eric Lindholm lay motionless on the frozen earth, his breath barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. The wind off the Baltic Sea cut through his greatcoat like a blade, carrying with it the smell of salt and snow. Before him, obscured by dense rolling fog, stood 3 German watchtowers, invisible to the naked eye, invisible to standard military optics, invisible to every other soldier in his unit, but not to him. Through the modified scope pressed against his eye, Lindholm could see them. The towers shimmered at the edges, their silhouettes wavering like mirages in the mist. The glass in his scope, a piece of salvaged German range-finding equipment he'd spent 3 weeks secretly grinding, polishing and calibrating, bent light in ways that shouldn't have been possible with 1945 technology. It filtered wavelengths, separated spectrums, revealed what the fog tried to hide. His spotter, Private Wesley Grant, lay beside him, peering uselessly through standard-issue binoculars. "I can't see a damn thing, Eric. Command was right. Visibility's 0. Lindholm's finger rested lightly on the trigger. The tower closest to him was approximately 400 yards distant. Inside, he could make out the thermal signatures of at least 2 men. German spotters, watching for the American patrol that was scheduled to move through this sector in 20 minutes. His patrol. 23 men who would walk straight into an ambush if those watchtowers remained operational. "They're there," Lindholm whispered. 3 towers. Northwest, north, and northeast. 2 men in each. Grant shook his head. "You can't possibly see that." "I can see it. Battalion ordered us to report and withdraw if visibility drops below 50 yards. We're at 0, Eric. We follow protocol." Through his scope, Lindholm watched one of the German spotters raise binoculars toward the American lines. They were searching, waiting. In 20 minutes, they would see his unit's patrol and call down artillery that would tear those men apart before they understood what was happening. The penalty for using unauthorized equipment, modifications, was court-martial. The penalty for disobeying direct orders during combat operations could be execution. But the penalty for doing nothing was 23 dead Americans and German control of this coastal approach for another week. Lindholm's hands, steady despite the cold, made minute adjustments to the forbidden scope. The glass hummed faintly, a vibration only he could feel, transmitted through the metal housing into his cheekbone. "If I'm wrong," he said quietly, "they'll strip my rank and send me to the stockade. And if you're right, we go home tonight." He exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. Eric Lindholm had been born on June 3, 1919, in a small fishing village on the coast of Maine, where fog was not an obstacle but a constant companion. His father, Henrik Lindholm, was the town's optician, a craftsman who had learned his trade in Stockholm before immigrating to America in 1902. The Lindholm shop occupied the ground floor of their home, and young Eric spent his childhood in that workshop, watching his father transform raw glass into instruments of precision. Henrik specialized in maritime optics. Ship's captains and lighthouse keepers came to him for telescopes that could penetrate fog, binoculars that could distinguish a channel marker from a rock in heavy weather, signal lamps calibrated to cut through sea mist. "Light," Henrik told his son, "is not one thing. It is many things traveling together. Separate them, and you can see what others cannot." By age 12, Eric understood the principles of refraction, chromatic aberration, and wavelength separation. By 15, he was grinding lenses himself, learning to feel the glass's imperfections through his fingertips, understanding how each curve and angle would bend light in specific, predictable ways. His father taught him that every material, glass, crystal, even certain types of ice, had unique optical properties. "The world is full of tools," Henrik said, "if you know how to see them." But Henrik also taught him caution. "In my country," he said one evening, working late over a particularly difficult lens, "I knew men who questioned the old ways. Engineers who said, 'There is a better method.' Some were celebrated, others were punished for disrupting established systems. The difference was not whether they were right, but whether those in power wanted to hear them. Eric never forgot that lesson. When he enlisted in January 1942, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, he brought with him not just his technical knowledge, but his father's warning about the costs of innovation in rigid institutions. Basic training at Fort Dix revealed what the Army thought of innovation. Soldiers used standard equipment in standard ways. Modifications were forbidden. Improvisation was discouraged. When Eric suggested to his platoon sergeant that they could improve night watch effectiveness by coating binocular lenses with a thin layer of glycerin to reduce glare, he was told, "The Army doesn't need ideas from privates, Lindholm. It needs obedience." He learned to keep his thoughts to himself. He qualified as a marksman, not the best in his company but competent, and was assigned to the 28th Infantry Division. By December 1944, he had seen combat in France and Belgium, had earned a promotion to corporal, and had watched good men die because doctrine valued procedure over adaptation. It was after the fighting at Hurtgen Forest that Eric began his secret project. His unit had lost 7 men to German artillery spotters, hidden in fog-shrouded positions. Standard scopes couldn't penetrate the mist. Flares were ineffective. Radio coordination was too slow. Men died because they couldn't see threats that were objectively right in front of them. Eric knew there was a solution. His father had shown him years ago how different wavelengths of light penetrated fog with varying efficiency. Blue light scattered, red light penetrated. Infrared, invisible to the human eye, passed through almost unimpeded. The problem wasn't seeing through fog. The problem was having the right tool. In early January 1945, his division was repositioned to the Baltic coast, tasked with securing approaches that German forces were using to evacuate equipment and personnel ahead of the Soviet advance. The terrain was flat, exposed, and perpetually shrouded in sea fog. Perfect conditions for German defensive positions. Impossible conditions for American attacks. The orders were clear. Patrol, observe, report. Do not engage unless visibility exceeds 100 yards. Conserve ammunition. Wait for air support to clear enemy positions when weather permits. But weather never permitted. The fog rolled in every morning and stayed until afternoon. German watchtowers, invisible in the mist, called down artillery on American patrols with impunity. In the first week, Eric's regiment lost 34 men to an enemy they never saw. Captain Morrison, his company commander, was a good officer but bound by regulations. "I know it's frustrating," he told his men after another patrol returned with casualties. "But we cannot waste resources firing blindly. We follow doctrine. We wait for conditions to improve." Eric said nothing. But that night, in the ruins of a bombed-out church where his unit had bivouacked, he made his decision. If the Army wouldn't provide the tools to save lives, he would make them himself. The church basement still contained fragments of stained glass, reds, blues, greens, each color the result of different metallic compounds in the glass itself. Eric collected them carefully. From a destroyed German command post, he salvaged a range-finding instrument, shattered but containing high-quality optical glass ground to precise specifications. From the medical supplies, he requisitioned unofficially several sheets of X-ray film, which he knew contained silver compounds sensitive to specific light frequencies. For 2 weeks, working by candlelight after his watch shifts, Eric ground and polished glass. He separated the German optical element into layers, inserted filtered barriers made from colored glass and X-ray film, recalibrated the focal length to account for the new optical path. The result was crude, fragile, and completely unauthorized. It also worked. The modified scope didn't provide true visibility through fog. Instead, it filtered incoming light to emphasize wavelengths that penetrated moisture-saturated air more effectively. The effect was subtle, Objects in fog appeared as vague thermal signatures rather than clear images, but it was enough. Enough to see a watchtower where standard optics showed only grey emptiness. Enough to distinguish men from trees. Enough to aim. Private Grant, who shared Eric's watch rotation, was the only person who knew about the modification. "You're going to hang for this," Grant said when Eric first showed him the scope. "Only if it doesn't work. And if it does work, then maybe fewer of us die." Grant considered this. Finally he nodded. "Don't tell me when you're going to use it. I don't want to be an accessory before the fact." On the night of January 13th, intelligence reported increased German radio traffic in their sector. Captain Morrison briefed the company. A patrol would sweep the coastal approaches at dawn to probe enemy positions. 23 men, standard reconnaissance protocol. Eric volunteered for advance observation duty. He and Grant moved into position 3 hours before dawn, occupying a small rise 800 yards from the nearest suspected enemy position. Their orders were explicit. Observe, report, do not engage except in self-defense. At 500 hours, fog rolled in from the Baltic, thick and impenetrable. Grant radioed battalion headquarters. Visibility 0. Unable to observe patrol route. Request patrol postponement. The response crackled back. Negative. Weather forecast shows no improvement for 72 hours. Patrol proceeds as scheduled. Observe what you can. Report any enemy contact. Out. Grant set down the radio. They're sending them anyway. Eric was already scanning through his modified scope. The fog that made standard observation impossible became, through his filtered lens, translucent. Not clear, never clear, but translucent enough. And there, at the edge of his vision, he saw them, 3 structures rising from the mist like ghosts. Watchtowers, exactly where intelligence had predicted. Exactly where the patrol route would pass within 200 yards. "I have visual confirmation," Eric said quietly. 3 towers. They're occupied. Grant tried to see through his binoculars. "There's nothing there, Eric, just fog. They're there. And when our patrol moves through, those spotters will call artillery down on them. 23 men dead in the first 30 seconds. Then we radio battalion. Tell them to change the route. And say what? That my illegal scope can see through fog? They'll abort the mission, confiscate the equipment and court-martial me before lunch. And tomorrow, they'll send another patrol through the same killing zone because standard doctrine says those towers can't be there if standard equipment can't see them." Grant was silent. "Then, what are you going to do?" Eric made calculations instinctively. Wind speed, distance, the drop of a bullet over 400 yards in cold air, the slight tremor the modified scope introduced to his point of aim. All of it processed in seconds, the mathematics of death reduced to muscle memory and trust. "I'm going to make sure our men come home. Eric, listen to me. I've listened. I've followed orders. I've watched good soldiers die because we value protocol over reality. Not today." He settled into firing position, the modified scope against his eye, the forbidden glass showing him what shouldn't be visible. Through the filtered layers, he could see a figure in the nearest tower leaning forward, watching the approaches, waiting. Eric's breathing slowed. His heartbeat steadied. The rifle, an extension of his body, became motionless despite the wind. 400 yards, Grant whispered, his voice tight. "You can't possibly make that shot. Watch me." The crack of the rifle shattered the pre-dawn silence. Through his scope, Eric saw the figure in the tower collapse. He worked the bolt, chambered another round, shifted his aim to the second tower. The German spotter there was turning, confused, trying to locate the source of fire he couldn't see in the fog. Eric fired again. The figure dropped. The third tower erupted in activity. Someone was reaching for a radio, calling for support, alerting artillery positions, trying to understand how they were being engaged from an invisible position through impenetrable fog. Eric put a round through the radio first, then through the operator. 6 shots, 6 hits. The watchtowers, pillars of German defensive strategy, were suddenly blind and silent. Grant was already packing their equipment. "We need to move now. They'll have our position triangulated in minutes." But Eric remained motionless, watching through his scope as the fog began to lighten with approaching dawn. In the distance, he could see the American patrol moving forward, unaware that the death waiting for them had been quietly, impossibly, removed. "Let's go," he said finally. They were 300 yards from their position when German artillery began pounding the rise where they had been. Grant glanced back at the explosions lighting the fog. They're angry. They're blind, for now. What happens when you have to explain this to Captain Morrison? Eric didn't answer. He knew what happened. He'd known before he took the first shot. Some decisions didn't have good outcomes, only necessary ones. The patrol returned 2 hours later, intact, reporting no enemy contact. Captain Morrison was puzzled but pleased. Maybe intelligence overestimated German presence in that sector, he told his officers. But Lieutenant Shaw, the battalion intelligence officer, wasn't satisfied. "We had reliable information about those watchtowers. And I spoke with the patrol leader. He said he heard rifle fire from the direction of Lindholm's observation post approximately 30 minutes before dawn." Single shots. "Very precise," Morrison frowned. "Lindholm's orders were to observe only." "Yes, sir, bring him in." Eric stood at attention in the command post, Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Shaw regarding him with expressions that mixed suspicion with curiosity. His modified scope lay on the table between them, disassembled, its secrets exposed to men who had the power to destroy him. "You fired 6 shots this morning," Morrison stated. "Against direct orders?" "Yes, sir." "You engaged enemy positions in zero visibility conditions?" "Yes, sir." "Explain." Eric chose his words carefully. "I had visual confirmation of 3 occupied watchtowers positioned along our patrol route. Intelligence was correct. They were there. I engaged to protect the patrol." Lieutenant Shaw leaned forward. "Corporal, visibility this morning was 0. Our forward observers, equipped with the best optics the Army provides, saw nothing." "How did you see 3 watchtowers?" Silence. Then Eric reached forward and reassembled his scope, his hands moving with practiced precision. "I modified my equipment, sir." Morrison's expression darkened. "You did what?" "I modified my scope, using salvaged optical components to filter light wavelengths that penetrate fog more effectively. The device allows limited visibility in conditions where standard equipment is blind." Shaw picked up the scope, examining it with undisguised fascination. "This is... You built this yourself?" "Yes, sir." "From what materials?" "Salvaged German range-finding optics, colored glass from various sources, and medical X-ray film. The principle is wavelength separation, filtering out scattered blue light while enhancing red and near-infrared transmission. It doesn't eliminate fog, but it reduces its opacity significantly." Morrison and Shaw exchanged glances. Finally, Morrison spoke. "You understand that unauthorized modification of military equipment is a court-martial offense?" "Yes." "Sir, you understand that disobeying direct orders in combat can result in execution?" "Yes." "Sir, and you did it anyway?" Eric met his commander's gaze. "Sir, in the past week, this company has lost 34 men to enemy positions we couldn't see. I had the knowledge to prevent those casualties. I had the ability to save lives. The only thing preventing me was a regulation written by people who aren't here, watching men die for lack of better tools." The room fell silent. Outside, Eric could hear the company preparing for evening chow, unaware that one of their own was possibly facing the end of his military career, or worse. Lieutenant Shaw broke the silence. "Captain, I'd like permission to test this device." Morrison frowned. "Test it." "If it works as Corporal Lindholm claims, it represents a significant tactical advantage. Before we charge him, we should determine whether what he's created has military value. He violated regulations and saved 23 American lives this morning. Sir, with respect, we can punish initiative or we can use it." But we can't do both. Morrison considered this. Finally, he nodded. Corporal Lindholm, you're confined to quarters pending investigation. Lieutenant Shaw, you have 24 hours to evaluate this device. After that, I'll decide whether to prefer charges or recommend commendation. Dismissed. Over the next 3 days, Lieutenant Shaw conducted field tests that left him increasingly incredulous. The modified scope, crude as it was, functioned exactly as Eric had described. In fog conditions that rendered standard military optics useless, Shaw could distinguish objects with enough clarity to make accurate range estimations and threat assessments. He compiled a report. He requisitioned technical schematics from Eric. He interviewed the patrol that had been saved by Eric's unauthorized engagement, documenting their testimony that they had walked through what should have been a kill zone and encountered no resistance. On January 18th, Captain Morrison received orders from regimental headquarters. Corporal Lindholm was to be transported, along with his equipment and all documentation, to a technical evaluation facility in Rouen, France. His case had attracted attention from officers far above company level. Grant visited Eric the night before his transport. I heard you're being sent to Rouen, court-martial probably, or promotion. Shaw's report called your scope the most significant optical innovation of the war. His words. Eric smiled faintly. Innovation or insubordination depends on who's reading the report. For what it's worth, the patrol you saved, they've been asking about you. They know what you did. Some of them want to testify on your behalf. Tell them not to. Whatever happens, happens. I made my choice knowing the consequences. Grant hesitated. Why did you do it, Eric, really? You could have kept quiet, followed orders, stayed safe. Eric looked out the window at the fog rolling in from the Baltic, the eternal grey that had claimed so many lives. My father told me once that light reveals truth, but only if you're willing to look. I looked. I saw men dying for lack of better tools, and I had those tools or the knowledge to make them. What kind of person sees a solution and chooses silence because speaking up might be inconvenient? A person who survives. Maybe. But survival isn't the same as living. The technical evaluation in Rouen lasted 2 weeks. Military optical specialists examined Eric's modifications with a combination of admiration and frustration. Admiration for the ingenuity, frustration that a corporal with no formal engineering training had solved a problem their laboratories had been working on for months. We've been experimenting with infrared filters, one specialist told him, but our prototypes are bulky, expensive, and require power sources. Yours is passive, lightweight, and can be manufactured from salvaged materials. How did you know this would work? My father was an optician. He taught me that every problem with light has a solution in glass if you know how to cut it. The specialists wanted to mass-produce Eric's design. The Army wanted to classify the technology. Regimental Command wanted to quietly commend Eric without officially acknowledging that unauthorized innovation had proven more effective than standard doctrine. In the end, compromise prevailed. Eric was awarded a Bronze Star for exceptional initiative and technical skill in combat operations. The citation carefully avoided mentioning unauthorized equipment or disobeyed orders. His scope was classified as experimental technology and sent to an optical research facility in Virginia. He was reassigned to a technical unit where his knowledge could be properly utilized. The war ended 4 months later. Eric Lindholm returned to Maine in November 1945, honorably discharged with commendations that never quite explained what he'd done to earn them. He took over his father's shop. Henrik was old now. His hands no longer steady enough for the fine work of lens grinding, but his mind remained sharp. Eric told him everything. The Watchtowers, the forbidden scope, the choice he'd made to trust his own eyes over military doctrine. Henrik listened in silence. When Eric finished, the old man nodded slowly. You did what you were trained to do. Not by the Army, by me. I taught you to see clearly. even when others insist there is nothing to see. That is not a comfortable gift, but it is a necessary one. I could have been executed, but you were not, because you were right, and because lives were saved. Sometimes that is enough. Eric never spoke publicly about his wartime innovation. The scope, classified and filed away, disappeared into military archives. The principles he demonstrated, wavelength filtering, passive fog penetration, eventually found their way into Cold War optical research, though his name was never attached to the developments. He married in 1947, had 3 children, ran the optical shop with quiet competence. To his neighbors, he was simply Eric Lindholm, the optician who'd served in the war and come home. They didn't know about the watchtowers that vanished in the fog, the men who lived because glass bent light in ways it shouldn't. In 1963, a young optical engineer from MIT visited the shop. He'd been researching wartime technological developments and had found Eric's name buried in declassified documents. "I wanted to meet you," the engineer said. "Your work anticipated developments that took us another 15 years to achieve in laboratories." "How did you know it would work?" Eric shrugged. "I didn't know. I believed." "There's a difference. What was the hardest part? The technical challenge?" "No. The technical part was straightforward if you understood the principles. The hard part was deciding that the regulations were wrong, that my judgment was better than the chain of commands, that saving lives justified risking everything." "That's not an equation you can solve with optics." The engineer left with pages of notes. Eric never saw him again, but years later, he received a letter informing him that he'd been cited in a paper on early wavelength filtering techniques. His contribution, the letter said, had been foundational, though under-recognized. Henrik died in 1967 peacefully, in the room above the shop where he'd spent his life bending light to useful purposes. In his final days, he told Eric, "You were my best student, not because you learned the craft, but because you understood its purpose. Tools exist to serve human needs, not regulations." Never forget that. Eric didn't forget. In 1973, the military finally declassified portions of his wartime record. A journalist from Portland called, wanting to write a story. Eric declined. "What I did wasn't heroic," he said. "It was necessary." "There's a difference, but you saved lives by breaking rules. That's not something to celebrate. It's something to think about carefully. Rules exist for reasons. But sometimes those reasons become less important than the lives in front of you. I'm not sure I want to encourage people to make that choice lightly." The journalist persisted. "Don't you want people to know what you accomplished?" Eric was quiet for a long time. "What I accomplished was making a piece of glass that let me see through fog. The real question, the one that still keeps me awake sometimes, is whether I had the right to make the choice I made. To decide that I knew better than my commanding officers, that my innovation justified disobedience. I was right that time, but I could have been wrong. And if I'd been wrong, men might have died because I trusted my own judgment over established protocol. That's not a comfortable legacy. The story was never written, but the question remained. In 1982, the Army's Optical Systems Laboratory invited Eric to visit Fort Belvoir, Virginia, where they'd been developing advanced fog-penetrating optics for armored vehicles and aircraft. A young captain showed him through the facility, pointing out systems that cost millions to develop. "We're achieving 93% visibility enhancement in fog conditions," the captain said proudly. Eric examined the equipment. Massive, computer-controlled, power-hungry. "What does it weigh?" "The full system?" "About 400 pounds. But we're working on miniaturization. In 1945, I built something that achieved maybe 30% enhancement. It weighed 6 ounces and required no power source." The captain nodded. "We studied your design. It's elegant. Limited, but elegant. The problem was manufacturing. Your approach required hand-grinding custom optics. We couldn't mass-produce it, So you built something more complicated that does roughly the same thing. We built something that fits within military procurement systems, uses standardized components, and can be maintained by trained technicians. Your solution worked for you. Ours works for an army. Eric smiled faintly. I suppose that's progress. Do you ever regret it? What you did? Which part? Making the scope, using it, or disobeying orders? Any of it, Eric considered. Through the facility's windows, he could see fog rolling across the Potomac, grey and impenetrable, the same fog that had shrouded the Baltic coast 37 years earlier. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that men died before someone was willing to break the rules to save them. I regret that institutions value procedure over adaptation. But do I regret the choice I made? No. 23 men came home that day who wouldn't have otherwise. That's not something to regret. Eric Lindholm died on March 8, 1994, at the age of 74. His obituary in the Portland Press-Herald mentioned his military service and his 49 years running Lindholm Optical. It did not mention Watchtowers or Forbidden Glass, or the morning he looked through fog and saw what shouldn't have been visible. But in a small military museum at Fort Belvoir, behind glass in a climate-controlled case, sits a crude optical device labeled Lindholm Fog Penetrating Scope, Prototype 1945. The placard describes it as an early experiment in wavelength filtering techniques, and notes that it was field-tested with promising results. What the placard doesn't mention is that those promising results were 23 American soldiers who walked through a killing zone and lived, saved by a piece of glass ground in secret, used in defiance of orders, created by a man who decided that seeing clearly was worth risking everything. The fog still rolls in from the Baltic every morning. The watchtowers are long gone, dismantled or destroyed in the decades since the war ended. But on some mornings, when the mist is particularly thick and the wind carries the smell of salt, it's possible to imagine a young soldier lying prone on frozen ground, peering through forbidden glass at an enemy that shouldn't be visible. He sees what others cannot. He makes the shot that shouldn't be possible. And somewhere, years in the future, men who never knew his name tell their children stories about the day they didn't die, saved by something they never saw and couldn't understand. Light reveals truth, but only if you're willing to look. Eric Lindholm looked, and in looking, he saw not just watchtowers in fog, but the deeper truth that sometimes the right choice and the authorized choice are not the same thing. That courage isn't always about pulling the trigger. It's about deciding, in the moment when everything is at stake, that you trust your eyes more than you trust the regulations. That scope, crude and fragile and classified for decades, bent more than light. It bent the trajectory of lives, the course of battles, the understanding of what one person with knowledge and courage can accomplish when they refuse to accept that what everyone agrees is impossible. The glass that made watchtowers blur away in the tides of the Baltic wind was never mass-produced, never became standard equipment, never changed military doctrine. But it changed something more important. It proved that seeing clearly, really seeing, beyond doctrine and protocol and the comfortable certainty that what we cannot see does not exist, sometimes requires building your own tools, taking your own risks, and trusting that the view through forbidden glass might reveal truths that authorized vision will always miss. 23 men came home. That was enough.